as you can see here. The produced photographic if the table gives another knock, he closes it again. The scene repeats itself several times and starts over again in the following weeks. John Batty, a professional photographer, wanted to shed light on the heated contemporary debate, so at the end of the 19th century, about the existence and nature of ghosts through this experimental setup. He did not justify his engagement with spiritualist phenomena through any personal belief in the intrusion of a ghostly world into everyday reality. Rather, he explained it by saying that he had, and I quote him, for many years been a careful observer of the strange phenomena which, until recently, the scientific world had shut out as unworthy of investigation. But they have now, he continues, been violently pushed to the forefront and demand, with regard to their truth, to be honestly examined and tested. The experiments undertaken for this purpose were conducted in the house of a certain Mr. Josty in Bristol, with the participation of a mediumistically gifted friend named Mr. Butland and 2 additional persons. The experimental setup was as simple as described above. As was customary in spiritualist seances, the participants formed a chain with their hands to jointly release whatever energies might enable contact with the ghostly world. The camera was positioned to capture and objectify any potential apparitions, ghosts or other supernatural beings. To do this, Batty used a device typically employed for producing carte de visite portraits. It was equipped with a sliding mechanism that made it possible to expose several images consecutively on a single plate, as you can see here. The produced photographic series that could reveal possible optical changes within short intervals. However, the experimenters did not obtain photographic evidence by conventional means. On each occasion, Mr. Josty describes the evening procedures of the photographic mediumistic experiments in his house. We began by sitting together at a small table, whose movements instructed us how to proceed. According to these instructions, Mr. Batty prepared and developed both of the plates, while I directed the exposures, whose duration was always regulated by the movements of the table around which all except myself were seated. The photographic process was thus directly coupled with the practice of table turning, in that the table's movement determined the very moment of image creation. This method was meant not only to eliminate possible fraud through the photographer's subjective intervention. The experimental idea was rather that in the event of supernatural occurrences, a double proof could be established. First, through the ghostly triggering of the camera, and second, through potential optical traces that would become visible on the photographs produced by ghostly hand. The first attempts yielded no results. Nonetheless, Batty, Butland, and the others continued to experiment persistently and undeterred. On the 18th attempt, they finally produced a series of photos that revealed moving trails of light. The luminous forms, however, found no equivalent in what the participants perceived during the seance, except for one, Butland, so the mediumistically gifted person who assisted the seances. The technical and the human spiritualist medium proved more sensitive to luminous phenomena than normal eyes. This transformed and expanded the experimental procedure. From then on, one of the medium's central tasks after a successful séance was to describe his visions in detail before the photographic plate was developed in the darkroom. These protocols were then compared with the developed photographic series. When the two coincided, Betty concluded it meant first that photography was capable of making visible phenomena that were not perceptible to everyone. And second, that if these phenomena could affect both the photosensitive material and the human medium, then some form of existence could no longer be denied to them. In his project of honestly observing and examining a possibly existing ghostly world that interacted with humans, John Betty experimented in double sense. On the one hand, by striving to become a participating expert, so expert from experire in Latin, which means to experience. So become a participating expert on the one hand of spiritualist mediumistic seances, even if their success took some time to materialize, and on the other hand, by configuring these seances so that they met as closely as possible the methodological requirements of scientific experimentation. As the philosopher of science Isabel Stengers sharply formulates, a central characteristic of modern scientific experimental arrangements is, and I quote her, that they allow the author to withdraw, letting the movement bear witness in his place. In precisely this sense, Betty relied on the idea that if ghosts possessed any kind of reality, they would essentially record themselves, thanks to the experimental setup, without him having to intervene after the seance had begun. One might say that through this procedure, he gave the ghosts, with whom so many of his contemporaries were in lively contact, a chance to prove their intrusion into mundane reality objectively. But the task of experimental arrangements is not only to allow a phenomenon to speak, they must also succeed in silencing rivals, as Stengers again puts it. That is, they must succeed in silencing opposing views. By taking his contemporaries' experiences seriously and putting them to experimental test, Betty not only gave intelligent supernatural beings a chance to articulate themselves in a new way, he also gave those who believed in, or rather were convinced of their existence, of the existence of ghosts, a chance to gain credibility in relation to their rivals. Indeed, with his experiments, Betty created artifacts, or facts, that had the potential to silence quite different opponents. First, his photographic series exposed the fraudulent character of so-called spirit photographs, which had clearly been produced through simple double exposures and had caused sensational scandals since the 1860s. In contrast to, say, the spirit photographs of the American photographer Mumler, so this is clearly a double exposure, as you can see, where beings from the beyond always appeared in human, albeit ghostly form, Betty's transcendental photographs contained no deceased persons with human features, but only luminous phenomena, bright spots that changed shape within a series but did not crystallize into a final, clearly defined figure, traces rather than representations of otherworldly beings. But at the same time, Betty's photographs also rivaled a more socially accepted position that denied ghosts or ghost-like beings any right to exist altogether. For their production, he strategically employed precisely those techniques and methods that carried unquestioned evidentiary authority within scientific practice and discourse. For example, the self-activating camera, which, much like Jules Marais' graphic method that was developed just a few decades before, used to measure physiological data, was meant to allow phenomena to inscribe themselves into material reality. The seriality of Betty's images also functioned as a strategy of scientification. This technique did not simply capture ghosts or their traces in a single moment, it rather made it possible, and that is much like in Edward Muybridge's series of photographs of galloping horses that you probably all know a few years later, to render visible their figurative transformations over time. But Betty was not tracking horses. He visualized the influence of intelligent beings on the photochemical process. All that has been proven in my case, Betty summarized, is simply this, that there exists in nature a fluid or an ether which under certain conditions condenses and becomes visible to sensitives, and that when its radiation strikes a sensitized plate, the vibrations of its oscillations are such that they produce a strong chemical action. Whether when looking at such images and knowing how they were produced, one decides to believe in the existence of ghosts, extraterrestrial intelligent beings, or analogous light sensitivities between photographic planes and mediumistically gifted humans, or not, is beside the point, or at least it's not the point I want to make. What matters, I think, is that John Betty took seriously the constant spread of reports about the intrusion of the ghostly world into the social reality of his time, even though he himself was rather skeptical. He designed experimental arrangements to track down the modes of existence of these controversial phenomena, or rather, to give them so many occasions to manifest themselves. Although renowned scientists of his time, such as British physicist and chemist William Crookes, American psychologist and philosopher William James, or the French philosopher Henri Bergson, also took spiritualist events seriously as part of their engagement, for example, in the Society of Psychical Research, such engagement was risky. Anyone who revealed themselves as a sympathizer of spiritualist mediumistic endeavors, or worse, as a believer in ghosts, exposed themselves to accusations of charlatanism, lack of scientific rigor, and even madness. Declared opponents of spiritualist phenomena had it much easier, at least within scientific circles. Unlike Betty, who gave supernatural phenomena a chance to prove their existence through scientific experiments, they simply excluded such phenomena in an a priori manner from the realm of the real. Polemically put, Betty tried to do justice to the complexity of a reality in which more and more people were interested in and involved with ghosts, believed in them, and claimed to interact with them, whereas the critics of spiritualism generally responded with reductionist explanations, whether they were psychological or social constructivist in nature. This tendency in particular is particularly striking, that's an example, in Eduard von Hartmann's 1885 book on spiritism, Der Spiritismus. It is Hartmann who was really an important figure within the debates around these questions at this time. Hartmann advances his so-called hallucination hypothesis against theories that took the existence of ghosts seriously. He did not merely disqualify believers in ghosts as scientifically uninterested, immortally obsessed individuals, he diagnosed their radically irrational, purely hope-driven belief in mediumistic phenomena as symptoms of pathological madness. And I quote him, "If one wishes to engage with the literature of the spiritists, one must place oneself in the position of an asylum doctor." End of quote. Spiritism, which moved the masses, became for him a socially constructed event, a kind of mass delusion in which hallucinators infected one another with the erroneous belief in the reality of their perceptions. And I quote him again, "It becomes understandable why spectators with increasing spiritualistic belief encounter ever more richly developed phenomena, and why an intolerant skepticism which refuses to enter, even if only superficially, into the medium's imaginative sphere, must paralyze the medium's productive capacities." End of quote. regardless of who, when, where, and under what circumstances, experienced encounters with ghosts. Von Hartmann removed such experiences from the realm of reality, which was to be uncovered by objective scientific research, and relegated them to the domain of purely subjective or collective delusion. By attributing ghosts to the madness of their believers or superstitious interpreters, he made things extraordinarily easy for himself, as compared, for example, to Betty. He assigned himself the position of the rational, clear-minded thinker who disqualifies others without having to substantiate his own judgment empirically, experimentally, or argumentatively. On the contrary, his hallucination hypothesis functioned by categorically excluding not only the contested supernatural phenomena from the domain of normal reality, but also those who testified to them. This exclusionary gesture is characteristic, I think, of a dynamic through which the power of modern science continues to express itself. Reflecting on the scientific community's reactions to the so-called Belgian UFO wave in the 1990s, Isabel Stengers writes, "Scientists like it when the initiative of a questioning comes from them. When a phenomenon appears entirely outside their initiative, no matter where, how, or to whom, they do not appreciate that at all." End of quote. This aversion to what comes from the outside and the resulting reductionist gestures of disqualification, Stengers argues, are rooted in a deep-seated fear of losing control, or, as already William James suggested to frame it, the fear of even the horror of being duped. When a problem does not arise from within science itself, researchers initially stand in the same position as everyone else. They have no advantage, nothing that would qualify them in particular to deal with it. Not having the upper hand, not knowing better than. However, not only puts the superiority of their approaches into question, but in certain cases risks calling into question their entire worldview, and thus the legitimacy of the status quo. As again, William James once put this observation in a nutshell that I really like and which is worth quoting, and I quote him, "Why do so few scientists even look at the evidence for telepathy, so-called? Because as a leading biologist, now dead, once said to me," writes James, "that even if such a thing were true, scientists ought to band together to keep it suppressed and concealed. It would undo the uniformity of nature and all sorts of other things without which scientists cannot carry out their pursuits." End of quote. As with the UFOs of the 20th century, ghosts of the 19th century first appeared outside the scientific sphere of action. In both cases, ordinary people initially testified to their existence, threatening the authority of science, its claim to privileged knowledge of reality. In both cases, the majority of scientific responses consisted in disqualifying the phenomena and their witnesses. By relegating ghosts and UFOs alike to the purely subjective realm of belief and delusion, scientists declared them unworthy of rational investigation and, in the same breath, protected the status quo. This constitutive inertia of modern science toward ambitious exchanges between inside and outside might seem anecdotal in the case of phenomena like ghosts or UFOs. But if it becomes standard practice to exclude from reality the problems and experiences that people confront in their everyday worlds, simply because they are not generated within scientific research and or do not comply with the science's concepts of nature, then something quite different is at stake, I think. Under these conditions, the seemingly minor gesture, such as von Hartmann's with his hallucination hypothesis, of denying ghosts and their believers any legitimacy becomes much more than a bad habit of intellectual laziness. That is, to put it bluntly, because such gestures ultimately endanger, as against Dengers put it, democratic relations between science and society. My point here is not to revive, as you will have understood by now, the debates about the existence of ghosts, UFOs, or other invisible and extraterrestrial beings, in order to determine which party might have been right, the believers or the skeptics. Rather, the contrast I tried to stage between Betty and von Hartmann reveals, I think, two distinct scientific and simultaneously political stances. Von Hartmann chose the easy, socially accepted path of banishing ghosts to the realm of subjective madness, thus excluding them from real objective reality without having to prove his argument. Not only ghosts, but also those who claimed to interact with them were thereby declared irrational and consequently at once epistemically and politically inexistent. In contrast, Betty worked closely with mediumistically gifted Mr. Butland and several amateurs of contemporary spiritualism. That is, he drew on knowledge produced outside scientific research, knowledge about mediumistic abilities and their mechanisms, and sought to consolidate it using scientific apparatuses, media techniques, and objectifying methods. In other words, Betty qualified rather than disqualified. He attempted to create the capacity of judging justly rather than to condemn the phenomena and their practitioners from a so-called neutral or neutralizing exterior position. And he did so by experimenting together with others and, as far as possible, operating within two logics at once, a spiritualist one and a scientific one. His stance toward ghosts and other supernatural beings, whether he believed in them or not, was that they demand, with regard to their truth, to be honestly examined and tested. This stance produced, I think, thicker, richer, more diverse, and more surprising realities. Indeed, the ones visible in his photographs. Betty's approach thus allows, at least, to have a glance at what might be required for a culture of democratic relations between science and society. And I think I give the floor to Clemence, who will continue right there with my last picture, which is not a spirit from the 19th century, but a UFO photographer, which is obviously a fraud. But anyway, she will precise that.
So Clemence is going to continue. I'm just going to say, so everyone speaks 20 minutes. After that, I will have a talk with everyone, with all of them. And then after that, we can have a talk with the audience. Oh, yeah. I don't have my glasses. You see?
Ah, comment on fait il faut aller. Tu sais comment on fait? Hello everybody. So I will repeat a little bit some stuff. I am a filmmaker and an independent researcher based in Brussels, working at the intersection of documentary cinema and anthropology. The work I will talk about today began during a master's degree in anthropology at the Université Catholique of Louvain. My ethnographic research began with a group of Belgian ufologists who investigate UFO sightings. The group I followed is called COBEPS, the Belgian Committee for the Study of Space Phenomena, a small association that continued the work of SOBEPS after its dissolution, particularly in relation to the wave of UFO sightings that took place in Belgium between 1989 and 1991. From there, my fieldwork gradually expanded to many other people and ufological communities in Belgium and France. Since then, I have continued this research through the writing of a book based on this ethnography and through the development of a documentary film.
Ah, c'est pas la bonne.
C'est pas la bonne.
C'est pas le bon répété.
Sorry. We checked it before, but
Is this one here?
yeah, this one. The last one. But we checked it just before the. Yeah. Ah non, I gave you. Je te le donne par. Tu l'as enregistré avec mon.
Tu l'as pas mis sur le gros.
So you missed. So I will not restart. Huh? So you missed this slide about the COBEPS. Ah, there is no. There is a ghost in the
Yes.
room.
At least one. It's a whole collective of ghosts. Yeah. Now.
Il y a un faux contact, je sais pas. Là,
Je sais pas.
This is the computer. But this is good, a little break, because yeah.
I don't know.
No, it's not plugged. It can work.
No, it's not plugged. No.
Ça, c'est pas le bon.
Ça, c'est pas le bon.
Ah, ça sera le bon.
I don't restart. So, yeah. It's a screenshot from the COBEPS website. And this is a picture of the first European Congress on anomalous aerial phenomena. And yeah, there is Jacques Vallée, Bertrand Meeus, and Pierre Lagrange. And I will also show you today some drawings which come from the collaboration with the drawing artist Gwenola Carrère. Together, we explored how certain moments of my fieldwork could be translated into graphic form. The story Katrin has just told shows how certain experiences can sometimes be disqualified in the name of scientific rationality. My work focuses on a contemporary situation, an ethnography of people who attempt to investigate this kind of experiences today. The anthropologist Grégory de Laplace, in his book Les Intelligences Particulières, studies investigations into haunted houses, or more precisely, the people who investigate them. He shows that ghost and UFO experiences share many similarities. In both cases, people report encountering something unexpected, something that disturbs the perception of ordinary reality. Sorry, I was too fast. They often seek help in understanding what they have experienced. One could say that the ghosts of the 19th century and the UFOs of the 20th and 21st centuries raise similar questions. How do we make sense of experiences that do not easily fit within our usual frameworks of explanation? In some ufological communities, these worlds even intersect. Some groups discuss apparitions, UFOs, and other so-called paranormal phenomena together. The boundaries between these categories are not always as clear as we might imagine. My work approaches these situations symmetrically, meaning that I am interested in how all these people try to understand these experiences rather than deciding in advance what they are. Because what is interesting about this phenomena, ghosts in the past, UFOs today, may not only be whether they exist or not. What is interesting is that they bring together very different people trying to understand what they have seen. To make this more concrete, I would like to begin with a small scene from my fieldwork. It is October 2021. I am sitting in a car with Jean-Marc Batcan, who is responsible for investigations at COBEPS. We are driving toward a small village in the Liège region to meet a witness, a military officer who claims to have observed a strange object in the sky while walking his dog. But it is an opportunity for him to show me how a ufological investigation works. At that time, I had already been conducting ethnographic research on the UFO phenomenon for 3 years. During those years, I attended meetings, followed discussions, and read investigations reports, often without fully understanding what was happening. My fieldwork progressed slowly. The group meets collectively only a few times a year, and most activities consist of occasional investigations, training sessions, and discussions. During the COVID pandemic, most in-person meeting has stopped. So I also began observing discussions online and attending the ufological meetings in Brussels. I was discovering a very diverse ufological culture, but I remained largely an external observer. During the drive, Jean-Marc told me about the steering group, the small group coordinating the activities of COBEPS. I asked him, somewhat innocently, whether I might attend one of those meetings. He suggested that I send an email. I did so a few days later. And this is when I met what I later called an ethnographic mistake. In that email, I explained that my research partly concerned the question of extraterrestrial life. For me, this seemed obvious. But for them, it was a problem. Very quickly, responses started arriving. The group was divided. Some members were open to my presence, others were much more reluctant. At one point, Jean-Marc wrote to me, "You represent a potential danger for the group." End of quote. Not because of me personally, but because of how my research might represent them. He first expressed concerns about the social sciences. He mentioned the controversies of the science wars of the 90s, debates about whether social scientists were undermining the authority of scientific knowledge. In that context, the arrival of an anthropologist could be seen as risky. COBEPS wants to remain scientifically credible. But the deeper issue was something else. Contrary to the popular image, ufology is not necessarily defined by the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Within COBEPS, that hypothesis is considered only one possibility among others. Some members are open to it, others reject it entirely. And they are very aware that the automatic association between UFOs and extraterrestrial is precisely what discredits their work in the eyes of many scientists. Without realizing it, I had touched a very sensitive point. Looking back, this mistake was extremely instructive because it revealed the central problem of my fieldwork. What do we do with a phenomenon whose nature no one really knows? Within COBEPS, members sometimes speak about a knot. Not a knot, a knot. This knot concerns the interpretation of the UFO phenomenon. What are these phenomena? How should they be described? No one really knows. Some members prefer military, meteorological, astronomical, or psychosocial explanation. Others are open to more speculative hypotheses. But instead of choosing between them, the group has developed a particular solution. Everyone is free to maintain their own interpretation as long as investigation remains rigorous. The data must come first. This produces what we might call an ontological oscillation. Members constantly move between different frameworks of interpretation. The philosopher of science, Bruno Latour, has shown that modern society often claims to separate different registers: science, belief, politics, religion, or technology. But in practice, we constantly move between them. Ufologists simply make this oscillation very visible. Since 2019, my research has led me to meet more than 10 groups in Belgium and France and to conduct more than 70 interviews. Some groups are very skeptical, sometimes close to debunking communities, whose goal is to show that UFO sightings can be explained by known phenomena. Others adopt a more agnostic position that they call open skepticism, sceptique ouvert in French. And there are also those whom some actors call believers, convinced that UFOs represent extraterrestrial or non-human intelligences. Among witnesses, the diversity is equally striking. Some people experienced a single observation in their life. Others describe multiple encounters. Others report far more extraordinary experiences, including abductions, individuals who believe they have been taken by extraterrestrial entities. These experiences can produce what the psychiatrist John Mack called an ontological shock, a disruption of one's ordinary understanding of reality. Around these witnesses, we also find sociologists, philosophers and scientists, as well as researchers, working in what Deborah Battaglia calls outer space studies. This graphical overview tries to show how complex can be this fieldwork. Even the extraterrestrial hypothesis itself contains very different interpretations. One version corresponds to a material hypothesis, the idea that UFOs are technological machines produced by an extraterrestrial civilization. In some cycles, this is called HET1, the nuts and bolts hypothesis. Another version is more speculative. It suggests that the phenomenon might involve non-human intelligences interacting with perception of consciousness somewhere at the boundary between mind and matter. Those who take this possibility seriously sometimes refer to it as HET2, while skeptics usually describe it as a paranormal explanation. This perspective draws on authors such as Jacques Vallée, John Keel, and Carl Gustav Jung. But from the perspective of my fieldwork, what matters is that both interpretations point toward the same center, one that remains inaccessible. And it is precisely around this uncertain center that investigative practices develop. Contrary to the popular image, some ufological groups conduct very systematic investigations. At COBEPS, witnesses are interviewed using cognitive interview techniques similar to those used in police investigations. Investigators check astronomical data, flight trajectories, and meteorological conditions. They examine the location of the observation, sometimes interview neighbors, and consult archives. The vast majority of cases eventually receive an ordinary explanation, but a small percentage, around 3 to 5%, remain unexplained. And these investigations also produce very real social effects. And even when a sighting is explained, one may still ask why people mistake an airplane for a flying saucer in the first place. For witnesses, recounting an unusual observation can be difficult. Many fear being ridiculized. For some, the experience creates a deep crack in their ordinary understanding of reality. Some even ask themselves, did I really see what I think I saw? Am I going crazy? Ufological investigation can then function as a device that helps people qualify and interpret their experience. The mythology, To understand this dynamic, I found it useful to draw on the historian of religion Furio Jesi's concept of the mythological machine. His work is still relatively little known in France and Belgium, and I only discovered it recently, but it offers a very helpful way to think about what might be happening here. Jesi suggests that myths do not simply exist as ancient stories inherited from the past. Instead, societies build mechanisms that continuously produce mythologies, narratives, images, and interpretations that circulate around the center which remain inaccessible. The myth itself can never be directly reached. What we encounter is instead are the mythologies generated by this machine. Around an uncertain or unknowable center, an entire field of activity emerges. During my fieldwork, I often observed ufologists moving around such a center. They try to investigate, to classify cases, to test hypotheses, to eliminate explanations. And yet, the object at the center, what witnesses actually encountered, often remains uncertain. Around this uncertainty, however, intense activity is developing, the machine works. And in an interesting way, even skeptics participate in this machine simply by trying to dismantle it. The starting point of my fieldwork was a text by the philosopher of science Isabelle Stengers called L'Anomalie Belge. We can translate it by the Belgian anomaly. In this text, she discusses the work of a group of Belgian ufologists, the SOBEPs, who became well known during the UFO. Well, I already said it. In the Belgian anomaly, she highlights a gap between scientific institutions and people who claim to have had these experiences. For Stengers, this is fundamentally a democratic problem. When certain experiences are ignored or dismissed by scientific institutions, they do not disappear. They continue to exist for those who experience them. And when these questions no longer find a collective space of investigation, they may be captured by other actors like gurus, sects, or conspiracy theories. In an interview, Stengers once described the ufologists of COBEPS as adventurers of democracy, not because they possess a hidden truth, but because they accept taking seriously questions that science often prefers to avoid. Different regimes of truth have always coexisted, but today, within some ufological communities, personal experience and emotional conviction sometimes seem to carry more weight than systematic investigation. The hiatus described by Isabel Stengers may be widening, and perhaps the kind of rigorous investigation that groups like COBEPS still try to defend is becoming less visible. What my fieldwork shows is that UFOs clearly exist as a social and cultural phenomenon. But my research does not attempt to answer the question of their material existence. I am fairly certain that each of us in this room already has an image of what an extraterrestrial might look like. None of us has ever seen one, and there is still no proof that life exists elsewhere. Perhaps the most interesting question is not what UFOs are, but what they force us to think about. In little. And the same picture. That's it.
Thank you. So we have now Claire Williams, who's going to present her work.
Good evening. Thank you for all being there. It means a lot. So I'll start a presentation. Let's start. That I named Uncertain Materials. Imprints of the invisibles, fluid materialities, and astral travels to extraterrestrial lands have been investigated by researchers and practitioners of the mid-19th century. In order to reveal what was not invisible or not directly palpable in the air or in the ether, they assembled devices, instruments, bodies, and DIY experiments in an attempt to discover or reveal the existence of other realities. They manipulated different types of energy matter, such as dreams, visions, ectoplasm, aura, electromagnetism, occult chemistry, and many more. Too unstable to be harnessed by our current techniques, invisible materialities and the materials they are made of are often considered as an interface, a microscope or telescope between us and other spaces, worlds of things that are not part of our direct reality. Considered as a cult, not quite an artifact or an isolated material, these archives of the invisible defy a traditional scientific classification. So I propose here that we observe them not just for what they attempted to prove, but for what they actually do produce. So let's remember that these experiments were happening in the same ether where other discoveries did get validated and retained by science, such as the X-rays of Roentgen or the radium that irradiated from radioactivity, the electromagnetic property of brainwaves, or the existence of cosmic rays. These experiments started where researchers, scientists, and mediums of the mid-19th century were standing in a world where all the living and non-living are bathed in a permeated substance called the ether that was thought as a medium that interconnected the planets, animal, plants, and humans. These experiments took place in a world where we could connect, transmit, and receive messages from the newly deployed telegraph devices, and then, of course, the apparition of telephone lines and radio where disembodied voices and messages are transmitted from one place to another, through the air or through wires. So, discovering outer realities, visiting extraterrestrial spaces, and civilizations were as occult as what these technological inventions demonstrated. For this presentation, I chose a few of the productions that were made for us to plunge closer to these worlds. In this way, and in my work, it is always to try and attempt to restore the materials that were discredited by a material and scientific culture, and by placing them back in the generative fluxes and subsistence of the complex ocean of materials we live in, the place in which we all create objects, thoughts, forms, media, and information, and by taking the idea that Tim Lingle suggests that things, materials, are in life, rather than that life is in things. Plants, fingers, hands, or objects are layered on a glass plate. We are in a total darkness. When we push the big button, we activate the circuit. An intense and concentrated light sparks instantly from a halo around the subjects. The electricity forms irradiating serpentine figures. The blind light lasts only a few seconds and the darkness comes back instantly. We can smell the traces of the corona discharge in the air, a clear ozone smell mixed with the smell of heated materials. We observe attentively the shapes and imprints of the electrons on the photographic paper or on the digital pictures. They become clues of potential revelations of the energy matter or aura that radiate from animate or inanimate things. Healers, hot-tempered people, monks, plants, magnets become subjects that are electrified. Les sensitifs say they can directly perceive a light emanating from organisms or crystals without all this circuitry. They perceive the flares or rays of color surrounding them. Others don't see, but feel as if they were like magnets that were drawn to certain elements. Others are experimenting with silver nitrates in photographic plates to see if they can direct, control, or influence the invisible matter of the ether to leave an imprint of the invisible by concentrating their thought to print a picture, an emotion, or an inner voice, or leave the ether reveal itself. At night, Madge Donahoe presses a packaged photographic plate against her face. She entered in communication with unseen operators and obtained detailed instructions on making the photograph. She has produced almost 4,500 images, portraits of the departed, scenes of beyonds, scripts encoded. Others direct their minds into different planes, outside our ordinary reality, the materialities that take shape inside and outside of their eyes. For some, they are vibrant, colorful, abstract lines that are forces who materialize. For others, they are colors of thoughts, lines of energy that are sent on other humans using instruments. After observing that physicists were spending much time speculating on the nature of the chemical elements and the existence of the ether, Annie and Charles decided to travel further in the atoms of the invisible bodies. As an X-ray device, they directed their astral travel into a selection of minerals to perceive the constitutions of their chemical compounds. They encounter spinning atoms, occult chemical elements, metanium, anu, radium, known and unknown, that move, attract, dissolve, or assemble in distinct ways. As Annie describes, the next substance investigated was oxygen, a far more complicated and puzzling body. The difficulties of observations were very much increased by the extraordinary activity shown by this element and the dazzling brilliancy of some of its constituents. The gaseous atom is an ovoid body, within which a spirally coiled snake-like body revolves at a high velocity. 5 brilliant points of light shining on the coils, the snake appears to be a solid rounded body, but on erasing the atom, the snake splits lengthwise into 2 waved bodies, and it is seen that the appearance of solidity is due to the fact that these spin around in a common axis. In their houses, mediums start receiving codes, queer alphabets, from extraterrestrial worlds that they decipher like a Morse code or demodulate like a radio signal. Or sometimes they let themselves directly actioned by other entities. They pronounce the sounds and speeches that are transmitted by spiritual beings living on Mars or Ultra-Uranus.
Ceux d'Iani Mésir, Ipéné Penézé, Musé, Mazé, Tipastiné et Chevrain, Nivatim qui est Anidi, Navazemida, et Tezatana Evai, Divine.
They parallelly visited with soul flights, known and unknown extraterrestrial planets and stars, Mars, Ultramars, the Sun, Jupiter. Sarah Wakes and Helen Smith are accompanied by their spiritual guides that lead them into inhabited or habited places. As they walk in these extraterrestrial landscapes, they converse with their guides and they discover the science, the philosophy, the arts, and spirituality of those planets and their inhabitants. They describe to us the landscape, the touch of elements, the smells, the taste and sounds. In the same way, Elizabeth, her son, and her sister-in-law Anne, the Dentons, describe their discovery of different sorts of gaseous matter, the feeling of gravity, and the touch of strange water as they visit the heart of the Sun, Mars, or Jupiter.
I find myself within the sun's atmosphere, which is of wonderful density, being composed in great part of substances, which, at the highest temperatures known to us, would be solid. But here are gaseous. It is so dense that it strikes one as strange that it should be gaseous. It is luminous and intensely magnetic. Now I endeavor to penetrate to the very heart of the sun itself. I leave one part of myself at the threshold, sending another and more subtle part far into the interior. I go on and on and on, until all is one molten mass, not a dark speck in it, clearer than crystal, yet not crystallized. Without flames, without fire, yet far more subtle and pervading than any heat of which we can conceive. Language fails to convey an adequate idea of its calm intensity. I think it is wholly electrical, but will examine farther. It is not a consuming heat, in this respect different from the heat in the sun's atmosphere. I am confident that the great power operating in the heart of the sun is magnetism, which becomes modified into heat as it approaches the outer portion. The material in the very central portion of the sun, though so highly compressed as to partake of some characteristics of a solid, is, nevertheless, gaseous. The compression to which it is subjected is so enormous that were it gross matter, it would be harder than anything of which we can conceive. I can give it no name. I know of nothing akin to it, unless it be the attraction of the needle to the lodestone. This attractive power is tremendous. I can look at it. I can place my hand on it. And it impresses me as containing sufficient power to bring to itself every planet in the solar system. I can perceive the globular particles of which this attractive material is composed, and that they are constantly in motion among themselves. They would be probably invisible to the physical eye.
In the darkened parlors of Seance Room, some of these materialities started to manifest in the physical, earthly world. During collective seances, the bodies of Eva, Stanislawa, Mary, and others are starting to ejaculate alien substances. White, cold, and humid forms come out of their inner body. A fluidic rope that they are connected to materializes in front of the ordinary people surrounding the medium and their assistants. A crawling shape, shifting substance. Sometimes the medium manages to direct the ectoplasm to throw it in a hot pot of wax to freeze its trace. These ectoplasmic or teleplasmic substances baffle the scientific, who are there to control, observe, and activate their scientific devices and seances. But each time they want to lay the substance under the apparatus, it disappears or evaporates instantly. As Juliette Bézon describes in her observations, I saw this substance emerge from the medium's body, naked, going in and out, evolving, moving around, giving the impression of something alive, a reptile, for example. I saw hands, arms, and faces forming. I followed the phenomenon from its disappearance to its disappearance. I can attest to its reality, but I am unable to explain the matter of which it is composed. To the touch, it is heavy, damp, and cold. Sometimes it feels like a spider web. In all this, I am not talking about the apparitions themselves, such as hands or faces, but simply about the material substance. And for a small conclusion, 4 minutes left. I have spent a few years in these worlds reading the lost books, reports, finding images, sounds, and trying to assemble all these elements together. An important note is to say that they are never left incomplete. It is mostly scientific men and researchers that have published and been credited, even though the women are the great majority of the subjects and experts in these experiments. Mediums, or experimenters as we call them today, have more rarely spaces to document their experiences, and at the best, they self-publish. It is always challenging to hear their voices. As an artist who has been wandering in the electromagnetic spectrum for more than a decade, finding ways to create devices to sense or reveal these matters and energies, intensely listening to all kinds of radio waves I could pick up, and complotting and learning with the cyber and techno-feminists, I needed at some point to study the media archaeology of our ether. This led to the co-creation with Deborah Levy of The Ethers, a space dedicated to its archives. To understand how the Western world lived within the electromagnetic spectrum and study its transformations socially, technologically, politically, and spiritually. Most importantly, I learned, practice with them instead of working just on them. This is one of the conditions for them to be taken down from the esoteric shelf and restore them, and finding ways to place them back in the generative fluxes and substances of the ocean of materials we live in. When I'm asked to present a small part of this vast collection of uncertain materials, each time I find myself always stuck, because each time I'm attempting to find a way to classify these materials, and in some cases their materiality. They come with contradictions, zooming out, narrowing down, but the more I look closer at what these experiments actually produce, the more difficult it gets. Each time I secretly hope for an invisible force or spirit that would guide my hand and thoughts so that it would reveal itself without my direct intervention. But instead, I have to each time try again and again and again to organize these archives so they can make sense. What could we decipher from the imprints, traces of the invisible ether of the mid-19th century before they were included or excluded from our material culture or scientific validations? What resisted and what was lost? There are many ways to think of these materialities and their substances, their political role, their artistic performativity, their scientific methodology, the spaces and device in which they were discovered, their vivid imagination and combinations. But by resisting to these categorizations and acknowledging them again, they force us to consider other ways of working with them. Maybe using more our intuitions, senses, making the magical word enter and creating spaces for them and giving intention to their manifestations, and observe how they resonate in our modern worlds. There are so many things to say, but I will just finish with a citation of Tim Ingold in his paper, Materials Against Materialities. The surface of materiality, in short, is an illusion. We cannot touch it because it is not there. Like all other creatures, human beings do not exist on the other side of materiality, but swim in the ocean of materials. Once we acknowledge our immersion, what this ocean reveals to us is not the bland homogeneity of different shades of matter, but a flux in which materials of the most diverse kind, through processes of an admixture of distillation, of coagulation and dispersal, and evaporation and precipitation, undergo continual generation and transformation, the form of things, far from having been imposed, from without upon an inert substrate, arise and are born along, as indeed we are too, within this current of materials. As with the earth itself, the surface of every solid is but a crust, the more or less ephemeral congruent of a generative movement. As they swim in this ocean of materials, human beings do of course play a part in their transformations, so too do the creatures of every other kind. Very often, humans take over from where the non-humans have left off, as when they extract the wax secreted by the bees to make the cell walls of a honeycomb for the further manufacture of candles.
Big question.
Wait. So we're gonna now have a little talk among us,
Okay.
and then let the audience ask questions. So first, I'm afraid that this subject is something which is so endless. Well, I see some similarities in the fields where the three of you are working in the sense that let's call it the invisible, or the but so. I want to start with a very general philosophical view on this, from where maybe we can start further. That modernity, basically, someone like Kant, Descartes who made the split between matter and spirit, and then Kant who actually developed his philosophy as a reaction to Spinozism at the time. And so he, as a pantheism, the idea that all matter and all spiritual, everything is in fact are parts of one substance, which is God. So there's one substance, and there was a big discussion at that moment of Kant about it. This was seen as something completely godless, and so he developed a philosophy against it, where he could say that God and the soul also are totally separated and metaphysical away from this world. But there has been a lot of reactions, and that developed in Weimar, in Germany, other views, and that became process theory. People like, and you can trace now a whole root Schelling.
No, but in Weimar, who?
Yeah. Well, approximately also. Well, Schelling is probably the most important, and you can trace the whole line of people like William James and Simondon, and then finally to Whitehead. Now Gilles Deleuze, Bruno Latour, Isabel Stengers, Karen Barat, Jane Bennett, who you can say it's all a process theory where everything is changing. So it's not anymore like you have matter that is stable, and you have spirit, but it's not so thinking in dynamics, and it is a way of seeing the world also with quantum mechanics, with relativity, and this is something that today is you see it in the social sciences, you see it in the natural sciences, and you see it in art. That so that it's not object focused anymore, but yeah, you try to see other things and dynamics, and so how to view this kind of things, and the things are related to some ways, and in that sense it's also in the social sciences. How do people are not just individuals, but that there are dynamics in them, and this is in fact some of the things that that I see is related to that. So how do you see other things that are beyond this matter, and dynamics that are at work? Still, it is very difficult to make a distinction between what is true there. So because a lot of these things are set up, people play with what is beyond this reality, and what makes part of this reality. It's very complex. Maybe I would like to hear, like, how do you make a distinction between some things that are fake? So we have seen also for the UFOs that 3 to 5% cannot be explained, and all the rest is people making special effects. So it's very difficult, and maybe I see now also that in a political way, where's the truth? And so everything becomes fake, and on one hand, we want to have this combination of things, thinking in terms of dynamics and thinking, but somewhere a distinction needs to be made between fake reality and trying to find the real truth. But that's maybe.
Okay, I'll take a try. I will not say something with respect to Kant, Schelling, and all of that. I take that as a kind of introduction into your question. I think, I mean, what you're hitting at the end, of course, is that we live in a kind of reality of post-factual reality, post-truth, etc., and that, of course, is very dangerous. But I will try. I think if these questions and all these sort of weirdo phenomena that appear in a certain way quite anecdotal interest so many of us, I mean the three of us, but we're not at all the only ones. I know that Jeremy Stollow is following us online, for example. He just published a big book on the history of picturing aura, little publicity, just appeared at MIT Press. If so many people today are interested in this, it's not just because we like weird things and we want to flee the real reality or something like that. I think what is interesting about these things is exactly, maybe if we want to link it to the question of post-factual, post-truth era, is that I think they allow us to understand at the same time the constructedness of every kind of scientific knowledge, because I mean, you also mentioned neutrinos and so on in your presentation. So you mentioned entities that are considered as real by the scientists today, but they could maybe also not have been discovered or not have been named neutrinos, and so on. They are quite improbable in a certain way. But I think what is important is that the question then, what I mean by constructed doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The question is rather, are they well constructed in a robust way? And I think this question can also be addressed. I mean, that's also what the SOBEPS does, for example. Yes, of course, there are fakes, but I mean, what Clemence was talking about was not so much people faking it, is they witnessed something, and then through the investigation, it was shown that there was actually an airplane flying around this evening that disturbed something. And so it wasn't really a fake, it's just that it couldn't be validated. But so I think I will finish soon, but you asked a very complicated question. I think if we want to also sort of get ourselves ready to answer to this whole post-factual and post-truth disaster that we're unfortunately in, it doesn't help to say that the real sciences produce real truth and all the rest should be devalidated. Because if we are in a logic where experiences that people make are disqualified and devalidated, experiences or things they witness, I mean, then we actually, I mean, James once called that we have put a hideous rift into the humankind. We actually risk making this rift even larger. And so I don't think the question is so much whether these things actually really exist or not, but who is authorized to say what reality is composed of. I think I'll stop there with the first comment. I don't know whether you want to continue.
Maybe take this microphone.
I don't know if, well, it's just my position, like I said, is I think that you're always bumping, and from my position, I'm an artist, I'm not a historian, I'm not a scientific, and I'm not a, yeah. So it's also, yeah, you always bump, if you start looking what's real, what's not real, how can, I mean, it exists. Somebody who tells you has been abducted, for example, is somebody who really went through a traumatic experience. And so I just take it from that, like it exists in a way, and whatever, if it's in the mind or real or whatever, for me the interesting is not that, the question is not that interesting. It's really what it produces, but also, as you really clearly said, it's also how, yeah, we see also in these heritage what has been retained, what is coming back also. Because I think there's a lot of, like you were saying, the mythologies, a lot of things come back, but it doesn't mean because it's a mythology it's true or not true. Yeah. It's about our experience of the world and the different realities we're occurring. The reality of the people of the 19th century was a different one than ones we are today, and we're all individuals with also different cultures and way of relating to the world. So it's more in this that I look at what that I was saying, I try to know what it produces, not what is it proof or unproof. So yeah, that's just...
Yeah, so for me it's yeah. Je peux parler en français?
On va la traduire. We'll translate.
Moi, dans un terrain ethnographique, sur un terrain en ethnographie, on se demande pas si c'est vrai ou faux ce que nous disent les gens. Enfin, moi, ce que j'essaye de comprendre, c'est vraiment la complexité et la diversité de tous les cas de figure et comment ces organisations fonctionnent et finalement à quoi elles servent. Par exemple, dans le cas du COBEPS, le fait de chercher à qualifier ce que pourrait être cette observation, enfin, moi je trouve que c'est un vrai rôle social et même existentiel pour beaucoup de gens. Voilà, moi c'est ce que j'essayais d'expliquer aussi par mon enquête.
Okay, I'll try to translate. I will probably not say everything. So what she said, from the perspective of the ethnographer, I mean, if you're an anthropologist, you don't really ask whether it's what people tell you. I mean, your informants, whether it's right or wrong. That's not really, can't be the question. You have to assemble the material, listen to it, and try to understand the complexity of, in her case, organizations like the SOBEPS, and try to describe how they proceed and what if. And also, I think you said, I don't know whether you remember what she said. I mean, you have to ask what kind of what they do, what kind of goal they serve, and in the case of the SOBEPS, it's also, I mean, it's almost like a service to society, because they actually take seriously people's experiences who otherwise would be left alone with these experiences.
Yes, so well, for me it's fascinating that it's also double in the sense that you want to go deeper to a more complex reality, And at the same time, the deeper that you dive, also I see just a parallel with the political world where we sit in a parallel truth, and so when these things get mixed, what are the tools we still have to divide?
It's a very it's a very wide question, the question of the post-vérité. Moi, je me la pose souvent hein, sur mon terrain, j'avoue, mais de la post-vérité. Mais ce qui est important, c'est que justement, il y a des gens qui essaient de faire la part des choses. Justement, il y a des ufologues, comme le COBEPS, ils essaient de faire la part des choses entre ceux qui croient par rapport aux hypothèses et puis les vraies enquêtes de terrain, où là, ils essaient d'avoir des données fiables. Donc...
To translate. Oh, no, I lost it.
I forgot. I mean, she basically said that she's confronted with the question of post-truth a lot on her field research, but that people like those from the SOBEPs also try to make distinctions between what is truthful or I don't know
what the investigation and the hypothesis.
Yeah. Between the investigation and the hypothesis.
And it's not connected. Yeah. There is a
distinction.
And I just maybe wanted to react as well, because of course, I mean, we can't stop trying to figure out what the truths in the plural maybe are, because I mean, that's the whole, at least the scientific adventure, but I guess even the adventure of art is in a certain way to produce truths. Not maybe in the same way of being sort of correlated with reality in the same way. But what I do think can make a real difference, you will talk about art, I don't do that. It's a bad idea because I'm bad for that. But with respect to the question of truth, I mean, William James, whom you mentioned and whom I mentioned also in my talk, who is one of the founders of American pragmatism, had a very interesting theory of truth. And his theory of truth basically is a theory of truth whose main criteria is the effects something has on either the people who experience the reality that a scientific research is interested in, or even on the molecular reality that a scientific research is interested in. And so if we take this seriously, I think this question of post-truth and so on can be turned around a little bit, because of course post-factual truths that are defended by completists or climate skeptics or whatever have very clear negative, I mean, if we act on these hypotheses or on these pseudo-truths, that will have and already has very real, very negative effects on all kinds of living and non-living beings. So I think the question of effects can maybe be, or an art of consequences, as James also called it, can be an interesting way of trying to sort of navigate this question.
You were talking about the HET.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. 1 and 2. And then so the one is that in fact UFOs are real from another culture. The second is that it's somewhere in the mind. And then there's the third one that is just a fake setup. And then there's a third one that is just a fake setup that somebody is throwing some place in front of the camera, which is also another possibility.
A third possibility. In the hypothesis?
In the of extraterrestrial, of UFOs.
I don't understand the question.
Une hypothèse extraterrestre, il y a une troisième possibilité.
Yes, but HET, it's not yeah, okay, so it's more like, it's hypothesis. So the fraud, enfin, comment on dit fraud?
Fraud, I would call it
The fraud.
HET.
The fraud, it's not in the same category because hypothesis, it's the hypothesis about what could be the extraterrestrial. So yeah, I don't think it goes. It's not the same on the same category.
But those two other
But
ones
fraud-
are two other categories.
Yes, of course.
So
Of course,
you have two
there are
categories. Yeah.
Maybe they are fake in both.
Not necessarily.
Maybe they
No,
are
but
fakes in both. HB1 and HB2.
well, no, you have to be open that
Yes,
there
of
could
course.
be a hypothesis
Yes, of course.
that is
The-
something else than fake.
What
So
I
it
tried
can be something really
Yes, of course.
in the brain.
Yeah. What I tried to explain in my talk that the HET they are separated normally by the investigation. The investigation and the HET explanation, it's separated. It's not the explanation of the.
How can it be separated?
But it's how can I say? Even if there is 3 or 5% of
Witnesses?
unidentified observations, this observation they are not explained by the HET. It depends. It remains hypothesis.
Yeah. But the hypothesis is that you try to explain in which direction that the experience can be explained. So, or it is really true, there is something technologically that is clearly alien, or it might be just an hallucination or whatever in somebody's brain, or, and that's then the third one, that is that it's just fake. So,
Yeah,
but
but yeah. I spoke only about HET explanations. It's on extraterrestrial hypothesis. I only explained that there is two hypotheses, hypothesis of extraterrestrial.
but it's so strange that you don't want to accept that there's a third one also.
No, but sorry,
Back to French, please.
En fait, ça n'a rien à voir. Les fraudes et ça ne fait pas partie de la même catégorie. Enfin, ce que j'expliquais, c'est que les hypothèses extraterrestres, ça fait partie de ce que les gens croient par rapport aux... Donc, il y a différents types. Donc là, je parle de deux grandes catégories d'hypothèses extraterrestres. Mais quand ils font des enquêtes sur les observations, c'est toujours un avion, Vénus, la Lune, et ce qui reste non identifié, voilà, ça reste non identifié. Il n'y a pas de... Donc les fraudes, ça fait partie des enquêtes. Donc là, il y a plein d'explications matérielles totalement ordinaires. Et donc, évidemment, les fraudes font partie, évidemment, de ces explications, mais il n'y en a pas tant que ça, en fait. La plupart des témoins, vraiment, sont de bonne foi. Ça, c'est vraiment prouvé.
On pense. C'est possible, hein, bon.
Ils vivent vraiment, voilà, mais quand on leur dit c'est un avion ou la Lune et tout, ils acceptent en général l'explication, et ils sont... Enfin, ça dépend, c'est vraiment...
Ça dépend.
Il y a beaucoup de diversité.
Okay, should I translate? Or did you prepare the translation? I didn't really prepare. I mean, that's a bit. I try. So what she said, it's also for the recording. No? So what she said is that the question of fraud and the question of these two HET hypothesis, HET hypothesis. a sort of a completely different, on a completely different level of the question of extraterrestrial life. In that the question of fraud when you are in an association like the COBEPS is something that is posed during the investigation empirically. So, for example, if they find out that someone has thrown a plate into the air and then taken a photograph, I mean, that's going to be a fraud. If there has been an airplane or meteorological event, that's not necessarily a fraud, but it's a way of excluding the extraordinarity of the event. I know that you understood, I just tried to translate. And so only what remains, so what remains, the 3 to 5% that Clemence mentioned in her talk, of where things remain unexplained, can then be subject to these two HET hypotheses, not the rest of what has already been excluded as being.
But it could be explained later, or it could be a meteorological phenomena that we don't know yet.
But it can always end up finally in the third category also.
It doesn't mean the 3 or 5%. It doesn't mean that it's a proof. No, not at all.
There is a question from the online. Some Jeremy, he asking, might the notion of epistemic injustice help address the problem of post-truths raised here?
Can you repeat that again? The problem of epistemic.
Might the notion of
epistemic.
Might the notion of epistemic injustice help address the problem of post-truths raised?
So epistemic is the research of this truth, and then to justice about that. So I think that the person means then what?
I understood the question.
Yeah, but I want to repeat it also because or explain it so that it is a post-truth. It's a question about post-truth. If that can explain.
Maybe I think what is meant by the question, I think, is whether so epistemic injustice is a concept that has been introduced by a philosopher called Miranda Fricker, and it really treats the question of who is disqualified and whose discourse is disqualified and therefore doesn't count as epistemically valid. And so there is a certain, so it's all about the question of which kind of injustices can be produced on an epistemic level. And I think the question indeed comes back to this whole problem of post-truth, etc., and maybe add something to what I try to solve with the answer about the art of consequences or a focus on effects is, of course, in all the cases that we treated, the people whose experiences or visions we try to sort of defend, at least the two of us, but I think you also in a different form, are people whose visions, experiences, and so on have in our habitual world have a tendency to be disqualified. So requalifying them is maybe also a way of producing something like a more epistemic justice in contrast to injustice. I think that adds a kind of aspect that we haven't mentioned in an explicit way.
Maybe someone from the audience wants to ask a question. Nobody?
They're all hiding. Where did they go?
They started to walk home.
Yeah, they don't have the train, so.
It's not really a question, it's more of a comment. So, science is often spiritual, because they're not, in order to discover something, you know that there might be something beyond the accepted truth. And often, like, new discoveries come from the fact that people go out of the box. They don't follow the scientific methodology, and therefore they're more capable of seeing something outside of the box. So because of that uncertainty they operate with, of course these scientists were just like completely blindly following the method. But others, they're more interested in what's beyond. And often they are also religious. For me it's also kind of puzzling, but it makes sense. They work with the uncertainties, with what is not there. And there's so much more not there when you work with science. That's not about the truth.
Okay. Well, I think we'll be fine. So, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Last question?
No, the last question.
Yeah. One before last.
Well, one last one before everyone's gone. Let's see if it's a simple one. Maybe you can answer it in 2 minutes. But one striking thing that I saw in many of the talks is, and that I'm wondering about, is the role of technology in many of the things, and how you see these ephemeral phenomena and the way that we deal with them. It's about visualizing them, it's about identifying or explaining them, it's about placing them in a context. But I see technology as kind of a threat, and I'm wondering whether you can see that threat into it, or it's a very important role in it, or it's maybe something more contextual. The technology is maybe not the underlying.
But what do you mean, the threat of technology?
I'm wondering about your point on the importance of technology in the 3 stories or in the 3 streams, that perspective that you've presented.
Yeah, it's a part of a lot of my research, because I do electronics, I do hardware, and I build these devices, so I'm also in it. And actually, these researchers arrived because, coming, as I was saying in the presentation, from techno-feminist and cyber-feminist realms, it was also a question of like, but what heritage do we have, unless the heritage of white men in the scientific history? And I was trying to find like what were the relationships with invisible, and it's actually by when I was discovering actually what was lost and considered as non-science, that there I found a lot of resonance with what I think are techno-feminist practices, for example. And also what it's really interesting and it resonates, I think, with a lot of artistic works, is that the scientific men were researching a lot with and observing the mediums. And I speculate a lot that I think that radio could not have been invented if Oliver Lodge was not like investigating on the medium for many years. And there was a lot of influences on it, of course, Ben accredited. And also, I think that the mediums propose a very alternative technology. So instead of something being hard and objective, because of course also, yeah, for example, the photography, all these machines, they could not be hallucinated. That's why they started to be the third eye inside the seance room to see if it's true, not true, or just as something to observe. So all these archive images are really images to try and study. And what's interesting with the mediums is that they use their bodies as a technology. That's why all these accounts of astral travel, and it's, I think, very important because it's also gave an alternative way of thinking of technology. And we decided today that vision, for example, would be something that would be the most important way to do science, but it could have been in another way if we had done other choices. So I think in these 19th century, there was a lot of very interesting experimentations, and they also make us remember that there were a lot of potential technologies. If senses had been, like if intuition had been a technology that we had developed, how would we be scientifically working today? I think it's these kind of questions, yeah, we have to ask ourselves.
Okay, I think it's nice. Yes.
I have a question, which is, I suppose, aesthetic or philosophical. we've seen many beautiful pictures, some less, some more. It's a question of taste and culture. But I was wondering, by making the invisible visible, isn't that counterproductive? Because it loses its invisibility. And then they will always be invisible. We have two worlds, the visible and the invisible. We have other worlds, but I mean, in this conversation. And so I was wondering if you ever thought of that.
I think that it's nice. It's also nice to make the visible invisible.
Okay, that's one answer. Another answer would be to leave the invisible because it loses otherwise its reason of being.
Do you think so? Do you think that the reason of the invisible is to stay invisible?
No, there is no reason. There is the invisible and there is the invisible.
I didn't know that it was a debate between you two. Go for it.
Oui.
Moi, ça me fait penser au hors-champ au cinéma. Par exemple, dans les films d'horreur, ne pas voir ce qui fait peur, ça fait plus peur. C'est beaucoup plus intéressant.
Je ne veux pas le voir. Mais d'accord.
C'est très intéressant de parler de quelque chose qu'on ne voit pas.
So I'm going to translate. So what she says is that it reminds her to in cinema the hors-champ, the off-screen, where suddenly in horror movies, so that what remains invisible is what makes you scared.
And I would add that I don't think that things are like a lot of these things they try, but they never arrive. You cannot make something invisible visible. Like you cannot make an inner voice experience. You can try a lot, but it never works. Somebody who has a spiritual, for example, travel, they try to draw it or explain it, but it never seems to give this experience. So I think it doesn't actually. We're always trying, but it never works.
Like the machine mythologique of Jesse, there is always the center inaccessible.
And also, I think just because it seems as if only these spirits and ghosts and so on are invisible, and then they are trying to be rendered visible. But actually, the whole history of science is full of things that were rendered visible. I mean, a molecule, you can't see a molecule, even less a neutrino, unless you construct a whole series that also comes back to the technology question, a whole assemblage of ever more technologies and dispositives in order to render, I don't know, to make it possible to render something visible. So I don't think that's something that is actually very particular about these strange phenomena, something quite common.
It's a quest.
I think it's also not only technological scientists. You can say that also the scientists in the humanities and also artists. They say that they make things, invisible things, visible. Like how society functions, how things behind it.
Yes, but illustration is not proof.
Excuse me?
Illustration is not a proof. That was said earlier on.
That's fine.
No, but
we should not. I mean,
No, I agree. We should not. I mean, because we see illustrations, but that's not proof. So they are still invisible.
it's beautiful, or it can give you another perspective on things.
There was a very nice example in an exhibition with one of the installations by Claire recently with psychic radio, where you could see that she was exploring a way of tracing those invisible voices, but you could actually just see the crystal radio, but not listen to it. And in fact, so many people visited the exhibition, and not so many people asked, and is it true that you can actually hear a lot of voices through this radio? I mean, not many people question it, the fact of just knowing and that there was an exploration being made through that table and those embroidery, and that was already something that was kind of like intriguing and exciting to see. It was a path for the unknown, but it was already enough. It was kind of nice and explanatory of this idea of, unveiling the invisible and exploring it in a different way. Yeah. I mean, she can explain it so much better than me. With psychic radio, I invite Claire to explain it, but it was a very nice example.
Okay, well, we can close the night, I think. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very interesting to listen to you, and thank you very much to IMAL, to Danny helping us just to be very well heard by on streaming, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.